Indie animation. It's a phenomenon that's become quite the talking point in recent years, hasn't it? Professionally animated cartoons free from the clutches of industry control that are more often than not completely free to anyone with an internet connection. Yeah, they usually can't compete with the faster release schedules of industry cartoons, but in a world where suits are pushing to let machines bombard us with generic artificial schlock, is waiting really that bad? Although come to think of it, this stuff is infecting the internet faster than it is TV, so these shows might not be as safe as we think. Nevertheless, indie animation has truly taken the cartoon world by storm, and in response, all I have to ask is, am I crazy? I mean, I can't be, right? I've been watching stuff like this since I first learned how to use a search bar. And I'm not just talking about shorts, I mean full-on animated series. There were those Rooster Teeth shows, or that cartoon channel Smosh used to host, or those parody series if you're willing to count them. Hell, The Annoying Orange began in 2010 and has been going strong ever since. And I use the word strong very liberally. With how many of these we've already gotten, why have they become a talking point now? You might say that episode-wise, most of these shows were pretty short compared to what we have now, but if that food truck clown show is getting lumped in with all this newer stuff, then that argument goes flying out the window. And of course, there is the fact the industry is kind of in shambles right now with the indie stuff coming in to pick up the pieces. But why is it only the newer stuff that people seem to care about? Why haven't these older shows seen a resurgence along with them? And look, I'm not trying to knock any of this newer stuff down. Some seem to do it just fine for themselves.
Does Millie ever peg you?
Sometimes. Wait!
Who am I kidding? The guy I'm about to bring up is infamous for stuff like that. I just wish all of these older shows were more part of the discussion. And among them, there's one series in particular that, if it were talked about in the same vein, I would take any day over what we have now. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce you to Brain Dump. Beginning on YouTube in 2016, Brain Dump is the, for lack of a better word, brainchild of one Max G. Also, if you're wondering, I actually do have a better word for that, I just really wanted to make that pun. The show stars Max G himself as an animated character. Accompanying him are an AI-powered TV named Burnbot and a wise-ass ghost named Goofball. Some other weird characters pop up every now and again, but for the most part, it's just those three. Simply put, it's one of my favorite animated series to ever grace YouTube, and it's one I've been planning on talking about for the longest time. So finally today, I give you my review of Brain Dump. Now for those of you in the dark about him, Max G is a cartoonist and animator who runs the YouTube channel Hot Diggity Demon. Despite being on the platform since 2007, I first discovered him in 2014 with the video Luigi's Day Out. It was a Super Mario parody in which a teenage Mario along with his punk friends torment his little brother Luigi. From watching it, I could tell that Max had an acquired taste, to say the least. Yeah, Max was, and still kind of is, infamous for his edgy, shocky, and just overall offensive sense of humor. It's something the guy pretty much built his early career on, and has even gotten him some flack a few times. Although I can assure you, I am not one of those perpetrators. Like, don't get me wrong, I can totally understand why you wouldn't find stuff like this okay, but I'm someone who raved about Postal 2. It's gonna take a lot more than what Max has put out to get under my skin. Trust me, I went down a dark path not too long ago. Get out of my head. Now with that said, I'm self-aware enough to know that edge for the sake of edge is rarely something you want to strive for. Generally, if you're going to do it, you want it to balance out with something else, and I think Max has been able to accomplish this to varying degrees throughout his career. On the one hand, you have stuff like the Jerry series whose risque elements tied into the struggles of adulthood, but on the other hand, you have stuff like Pony.mov where he took those cutesy talking horses from Hasbro and turned them into complete degenerates. Now, in bringing this up, Brain Dump is the first of Max's major projects where he openly calls himself out for the extremes he goes to. Well, I should say technically because, while he did make a few jabs towards it a few times throughout the series, he only really made it apparent with the most recent episode, What is Fascism? Without going into too much detail, the video has Max try to give a lecture on the rise of fascism. He does this to try and distance himself from his past work because he now has this notion that, as an artist, he has an obligation to spread a message message and not just be a shock jock. The thing to keep in mind, however, is that this isn't a sign of things to change. In the same video, there's a demon overlord who mistreats his scantily clad secretary, Goofball hooks up with a slutty ghost, Max sifts through a pile of goofballs, ectoplasm.
I just drank a whole glass of—
And all of it completely overhauls what Max set out to do with the video. In a weird way, it paints a picture that the depravity Max is known for is something that will always find a way to rear its ugly head, no matter how hard he tries to escape it. As I explained, this is a very new development in the series, so I might just be overthinking it a bit. If I had to be much broader about how Braindump compares to Max's older work, the show is actually pretty tame. It's definitely not family friendly, but he doesn't push the limits of bad taste here quite as much as he used to. Either way though, I thought my earlier argument made for a good talking point, so take that as you will. So that's what Braindump is like compared to Max's other work, but what is the show itself actually about? Well, that's complicated. With all of those other shows I brought up earlier, you might be wondering why it's Braindump I'm choosing to make a video on. Because after all, it's not like I can just make other videos. Well, Braindump is especially interesting to me because if you look at it now, it is completely different from how it started out. And I don't just mean there was a whole tonal shift or anything like that, I mean that Braindump now is a fundamentally different show from what it used to be. To give a brief run through of the series, Braindump started off as a sketch comedy review show. Max G, with the assistance of the sentient television Burnbot, would review movies while taking part in some loosely connected antics. Basically the kind of thing you see with the Nostalgia Critic or AVGN. Of said antics, the most abundant was Max's undead roommate Goofball interrupting the show. I'll go more into Goofball later, but right now, all you need to know is that he is the bane of Max's existence. Always butting in to mock the show. For a while though, it was never detrimental to Max's reviews. Even if he had to put up with Goofball's bullshit, the episode wouldn't end before Max could get everything he had to say across. With the exception of one joke video where he gave Suicide Squad a bad rating because it didn't entice him enough to bother seeing it, the videos were reviews first and foremost. Maybe not the most in-depth reviews with how short they usually were, but reviews nonetheless. Then in 2017, Max uploaded the video Theory Rogue One is pro-abortion. Did I mention Max's sense of humor? I don't think anyone clicking on this actually thought Max was gonna make that point, but if they're like me, we're probably expecting a real Rogue One review with the whole abortion thing being a throwaway joke at the end. I mean, I wouldn't hold it against him for doing that. Of course, it's not long into the video when Goofball does his whole interrupting shtick. However, instead of just throwing a couple insults Max's way, he strangely starts advertising a brand of knockoff Lucky Charms. He completely hijacks the video talking about the stuff, even getting Max roped in before he's able to snap himself out of it. By the time Max gets Goofball to leave, he completely forgets whatever point he was trying to make, only going on a meaningless rant about R2-D2. It's the first time in the series Goofball ruins one of Max's reviews. Now, as you probably could guess with my description of what is fascism, stuff like this would become more common as the series went on. Watching it for the first time though, I thought it was just gonna be a one-off. Another little joke video to mix things up, and for a while, that seemed to be the case. Over the next few videos, Max would continue to review movies and even incorporate a few shows. Little did I know the Rogue One episode was a sign of something to come, because the same thing happened in 2018 with the release of Top 10 Reasons the Grinch is Bullshit. As Max attempts to explain why the Illumination version of the Grinch fails as an adaptation of the original story, Goofball once again hijacks the episode beyond saving. Although this time around, it takes a drastic turn. Arguing ensues between the two, with them eventually trying to coax Burnbot to join their sides. It's during this when Max suddenly explains to Goofball she would only side with him on account of her being his TV. Yeah, apparently Max doesn't see Burnbot as an actual person, but just an unthinking machine. It's a jarring reveal into how this guy actually thinks, and one that I might have some strong opinions of. But I'll get to that when I get to that. All you need to know right now is that Burnbot does not like hearing that and immediately leaves the show. She apparently has a car she can drive away in. Over the next few videos, Max is a wreck. He's unable to review movies without Burnbot showing off clips, and even tries taking the show in several new directions only for them all to fall apart. It's the first time in the series Max is unable to run his show, putting any and all attention on him. Now eventually Burnbot did come back, and with it, Max apologizing for what he said to her. So that's it, right? The show would go back to reviews? Strangely enough, no. There was some clickbait making you think otherwise, pretty much what he was already doing with the Rogue One and Grinch videos. But for whatever reason, the show would stick with focusing on Max. His life, his goals, his struggles, and his antics with other characters like Goofball or Burnbot. Sometimes. Again, I'll get to that when I get to that. Literally speaking, brain dump isn't the same as what it used to be. And while that kind of statement is usually meant to signify a show's downfall, I honestly don't mind the new direction. Partially because those antics were pretty much always part of the show, even with the reviews, but also because when it came to the focus on Max, well, let's just say there's a lot to go over there. One trope that's become more and more of a turnoff over the years would definitely have to be the self-insert. Whether it be reshaping an established character to be more like them, or just straight up putting themselves in with no regard for whether or not it fits, people don't like it when creators insert themselves into a piece of fiction as a way of boosting their own ego. It's a shame too, because I don't think self-inserts on their own are inherently bad. Said creators just need to curb their own egos so as not to turn themselves into God's gift, and in the case they're literally just making themselves a character, play off of that fact by having their real-world identity relevant to the story. Max G's take on himself in Brain Dump is a fantastic example of this. Although, you might not notice that right away. Because Brain Dump started off as a review show, Max wasn't so much a character as much as he was the actual guy talking through a caricature of himself. It's something you see me and so many other YouTubers do. The only real difference being that Max's caricature is a 3D rig he can fully animate. The Brain Dump version of Max didn't start becoming his own character until entities like Goofball became more prevalent. Obviously fictional players that, through Max's interactions with, separated him from his real-life counterpart. Either that or Max is hiding evidence of the afterlife from us. Throughout the show, Max would still frequently address the audience, but with the new status quo, it served as a form of fourth wall breaking as opposed to a general narration from a real-life person. There was still a clear distinction between this Max and this Max. Now that's all fine and good, but that doesn't really tell us how Max writes himself into the show like I described. So how does he do it? Well, first off, do aspects of Max's real life come into play? Short answer, yes. He takes some liberties with it for sure. I mean, I doubt one of his sponsors was a literal demon named Ray D Shadow Legend, but him being a YouTuber is continually referenced throughout the show and becomes more important as the series goes on. My little run through of what is fascism being a pretty good example of this. On top of that, Max's character being modeled after himself plays into some self-deprecating humor, and he occasionally recounts real-life experiences that might back up a certain talking point. Although I guess you could argue the latter doesn't really count because those have more to do with the reviews and not Max himself. Regardless, elements of Max's real life do come into play. So what about the second thing? Is Max just using this character to boost his own ego? Well, not only is that not the case, but at times it's the exact opposite. That isn't to say though you can't take some pride in being the face of something. Hell, to a certain extent it's kind of inevitable when you make stuff like this. Like I remember how well my Hoodwinked video did and immediately thinking to myself, watch out Mark, I'm coming for ya. And for Max's reviews specifically, I guess there is a sense he thinks pretty highly of himself when he's talking. Like any good reviewer though, what matters is whether or not he's letting his own image do the heavy lifting for what are otherwise poorly written critiques. To dissect every review of his piece by piece would be way beyond the scope of this video, so to keep it brief, just about every talking point Max gives is as sound and as carefully thought out as it needs to be. With the exception of his clickbait troll videos, which, in their defense, are mostly just a front for when Brain Dump started shifting focus. Even if you don't always agree with him, he goes into as much detail on a topic as possible in a way where it makes sense why he came to a certain conclusion. He doesn't expect his audience to take anything at face value. Which I guess you could argue is exactly what I'm doing, keeping things brief, so I guess feel free to call me out if you watch the show for yourself. Now with all that said, that's just how Max is as a reviewer. How does he portray himself as an actual character? Well, take away a script for him to fall back on and every bit of pride and confidence you got watching him goes flying completely out the window. Throughout the series, Max struggles to run his YouTube channel, can't bring himself to step out of his comfort zone, thinks he's smarter than he actually is despite easily buying into bullshit, thinks he's owed more than what he deserves, and is just overall unhappy with his mess of a life. What makes this stuff especially stick with you is that, while again this Max and the real life Max are still two different entities, you can't help but think what the real guy must have been going through to warrant portraying himself this way. Essentially, brain dump is a way for the real Max to vent his own frustrations in life. However, instead of just complaining about the world around him, he portrays himself in a negative light as a way of self-reflection, challenging himself on whether or not those frustrations are even justified. It is perhaps the most brutally honest take a YouTuber has ever had on themselves. Although, there is one instance where that negative light was a bit too bright. Or dark, I don't know how negative lights work. Yeah, that whole reveal of him seeing Burnbot as nothing but an unthinking machine, bullshit. The storyline that follows is fine, I guess, aiming to call him out for being a shitty person, but it almost feels unwarranted because it makes no sense he would think that way to begin with. Sure, Max was no saint before then, but for him to be working so long with this adorable, expressive, personality-driven TV only to regard it as an inanimate object was just fucking nonsense. Maybe this was loosely based on an interaction the real Max had with somebody and this was his way of admitting to it, but in the context of Brain Dump itself, there's no build-up to it. Before then, he always interacted with her as if she were a real person. So yeah, things went a bit too far there, but for the most part, Max's flaws aren't nearly enough to make him unlikable. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is Max, a self-insert done right. Of course, Brain Dump isn't just about Max. You can't talk about the show without bringing up America's favorite cartoon mascot, Goofball the Goofy cartoon ghost is a ghost who is goofy. And a little shit. So, I actually don't have too much to unload with Goofball as I do Max. He's a pretty simple character to get a grasp on without the pretense of a real-life person to compare him to. Again, assuming Max G doesn't have a sixth sense or something. As I've explained already, Goofball is Max's undead roommate with a rude knack for interrupting the show. It's a classic Bugs Bunny-Elmer Fudd dynamic you've seen time and time again. Although in this case, Bugs Bunny is an occasional degenerate. All Max wants to do is host a respectable and thought-provoking show, and yet time and time again, Goofball will come in to mock him for it, and he revels in it. This makes it especially ironic whenever he's the voice of reason. As Brain Dump pushed to show Max in a more negative light, Goofball was the only one there to call out everything wrong with him. Okay, he didn't do it a whole lot, like 90% of the time he was still a devious little shit stain for the sake of it, but a broken clock is right twice a day, and even Goofball knew how to read the room from time to time. On one end of it, there were times he knew when to ease up on Max. With the distressful lows the guy could reach, Goofball would try to console him. He maybe wasn't very good at it, but those moments did show he wasn't just a little bastard. On the other end of it, his bad-mouthing of Max wasn't always unjustified. As we've seen with stuff like his Burnbot slander, Max is fully capable of being a shitty person who even assholes like Goofball couldn't just let run his mouth. Now I point all this out because I don't really think I can get away with simply calling him a mischievous comic relief. There is definitely a little more to him under the surface, ignoring the fact you can see straight through him. Although that is pretty much as deep as the character goes, so I do think he's still pretty easy to get a handle of. I know that might sound pretty underwhelming after everything I went over with Max, but I honestly just don't know what else to say. I don't think his simplicity is a bad thing by any means. If anything, his dynamic with Max is just a main staple of the show, even before it stopped doing reviews. In fact, if you had to be so blunt about it, you could just describe Brain Dump in its entirety being about a snot-nosed little brat making some guy's life a living hell. To put it simply, Brain Dump just wouldn't be Brain Dump without him. Not to mention, he's just funny.
No, it's not a movie about me, and I'm not a creep.
Are you kidding? You're the creepiest person I know, and I'm a fucking ghost.
What I'm trying to say is that Goofball isn't very complex, but he doesn't need to be. He's just fine being the goofy cartoon ghost that he is. I mean, it's not like he's a blank slate who doesn't even do anything. So, Burnbot kind of sucks. Okay, maybe not Burnbot per se, but it's kind of an issue when the most attention a main character gets is when she's completely absent from the show. As stated already, Burnbot is the sentient television in charge of assisting Max with Brain Dump. where he would present the video, she would play movie clips, show off doodles that reinforced a certain talking point, and close off each video with an artificially generated insult. Oh, Max, not you. The problem with Burnbot, though, is that she is so rarely anything more than that. She is always kept to the sideline, only ever able to express herself in short bursts. And I know what you're thinking, but Ginger Snapper, wasn't there this whole arc halfway through the series of Max learning to recognize Burnbot as an actual thinking person and not just a machine? Surely you're contradicting yourself here. And trust me, I will get to that, but first, just let me go over her character before that. I'd say that early on, it was kind of forgivable that Burnbot didn't have a lot to do. After all, Braindump started off as a review show first and foremost, and you wouldn't want too many characters getting in the way of that. Considering how Burnbot didn't talk either, it makes sense that the show would play favorites with Goofball. It wasn't a preferable dynamic by any means, but early on, I can understand Burnbot being a necessary corner to cut. Emphasis, however, on the words early on. I still waited patiently for her to have an actual role in the show beyond a glorified PowerPoint. Ironically though, when that did happen, it was immediately followed by her leaving the show for almost a year. And yes, that was to show off Max in a more negative light, but as I explained already, it didn't make sense for him to say what he said to begin with. Even if it did, however, excluding her from the show completely was just not the way to go. Like, could there not have at least been cuts to her living her life elsewhere while all of this was going on? But you know what? If I had to give the benefit of the doubt, it's a start. And as we've seen already, she does come back. And it's at a point when the series began steering away from reviews in favor of focusing on the characters. Surely she would be used to her full potential this time around. She, gets grossed out by an empty cum glass. Yeah, she gets just as little attention now as she did before. Literally after an arc that insisted she was more than just Max's TV. I mean, for crying out loud, this whole thing pretty much demanded she come into her own. Her role in the series should have been so much more with her return. So the fact that it isn't just feels like a massive oversight. Also, little nitpick, I wasn't a fan of her redesign. I much preferred her low poly facial expressions from before, and the new polka dot pattern she was decorated with just seemed way too flashy. I guess the flower was fine, but that's pretty much all the design had going for it in my eyes. Now granted, I'm pretty sure the redesign is supposed to be a visual tie-in to her being more than just a machine, especially with the rounder shapes giving off a more organic look, but since that plot point's been pretty much thrown out the window, her new look doesn't feel justified in that area. I don't hate Burnbot herself, but I do think the show is doing her a massive disservice pushing her to the side as much as it is. I want her to come into her own, and not just in the form of her leaving. As much as I like Braindump overall, this here is a real problem. Thankfully though, it's not beyond fixing. Max just needs to give her more to do so as to make her presence in the show stronger. Something I'm sure he'll take note of for any future installment. So, I end this video on kind of a downer note. It's been almost 2 years since the last episode of Braindump was released, and while I was writing this, I found out that Max was diagnosed with something called fibromyalgia. It's a condition I don't know too much about, but all you need to know is that it's affected the entire scope of Max's work and it's put Braindump on, and I quote, an indefinite hiatus. Ever since the last episode, Max is mostly stuck to live streaming, which, I'll be honest, I never really got into. In fact, I'm pretty late to the news of his diagnosis because he announced it on stream just a few months ago. Honestly, after reading it, I have been more compelled to tune in. You know, just to give him the support he may need, but I still really miss Braindump. I appreciate the fact he's somewhat keeping it alive by having characters like Goofball chilling out in the corner of his streams, but it's just not the same. Let me make it clear though that as much as I want the show to keep going, I don't want to hold it against Max for not being up to it. I do hope he will be again someday, but if this is all he's able to do right now, then I should just be happy he's still present. And if this truly is the new status quo for him, then I am thankful he was able to make everything he did beforehand. Especially what I talked about here today. Maybe he'll get better, maybe he'll get someone to help him out with his stuff, but regardless, I think Max G has truly earned his place on YouTube, and I will always consider Braindump to be his magnum opus. Good God, was I gone a while. This video was a lot for me to wrap my head around, so for the time being, I'm gonna try and keep things simpler. Nevertheless, if you enjoyed the video, then please subscribe, leave a like, check out the channel, and share it with your friends. Thanks for watching and have a great day. Take care.